Hey everybody, Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of Thyroid Thursday. Today we're talking about hypothyroidism, even hyperthyroidism, and insulin resistance. So it's a big discussion, especially in the functional medicine space, that hey, if you have a thyroid issue, if you have a cortisol issue, you'll hear people talking that hey, you've got to get your glucose and insulin resistance under control. And what I don't think people realize in our space is that if you struggle with chronic glucose or insulin resistance, it's not just about what you eat. It's not just about carbohydrate intake and lack of exercise. And that kind of discussion needs to kind of stop. Now, obviously, if you have glucose or insulin resistance, or you've been told you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, and you're consuming lots of carbohydrates and you're not doing any physical activity, you can correct those things, but you don't need a healthcare professional to really do that. Eat a healthy whole food diet, walk every day, do some strength training. You don't have to do excessive amounts of things, but you want to have kind of a balanced whole food diet. When you look at your macros, I like a 40% protein, 30% carb, 30% fat as a general rule. And primarily 80% of the time you should be eating a whole food based diet. So if you're doing those things, you're not overdoing physical activity and exercise, what else might be causing glucose resistance or insulin resistance that you don't have as much control over, okay? And it doesn't have something to do with your blood sugar and your carbohydrate load, because you may have been one of those people who's been told you need to reduce your carbohydrates. You're eating too much carbohydrates. That's why you have glucose resistance or insulin resistance or diabetes. And if the doctor or physician or health coach or whoever you're talking to just listened to what you had to say, looked at your health history, looked at your health timeline, looked at your dietary intake, they would probably know that this is a person who's not consuming excessive amounts of carbohydrates. They are doing some physical activity. So it's not a carbohydrate issue, overconsumption of carbohydrate issues. There's something else going on. And I think a lot of medical and functional medicine practitioners just don't get that point. If you have glucose resistance coming into the cell, that can be triggered by excessive stress, whether it's real or perceived. Excessive cellular stress is going to down-regulate glucose regulation. It's going to lead to glucose resistance, the need for more insulin resistance, and even potentially the reduced production of insulin over time. So when we think about what's driving glucose and insulin resistance, and I find that for the vast majority of people that I see in my practice who have chronic health issues, autoimmune issues, have thyroid issues, have been diagnosed with other conditions, the problem is less about their carbohydrate intake and more about the excessive cell stress response. Now, what creates an excessive cell stress response? That could be physical stress, injuries, too much exercise, too little exercise. It could be chemicals in our environment, chemicals we're taking in. It can be microbes, and we can have systemic infections, oral infections. We can have dysbiosis in our gut. We can have psychologic stressors, and psychologic stressors, what goes on between the 6 inches of your ears, can play a massive role. And it's one of those things that people don't even realize many times that they're dealing with. I had a client I talked to last week who said, listen, this is my everyday life. This is not stressful for me. But when you look at all the stuff she's dealing with, there's a lot of probably emotional stress, but because it's her everyday, she doesn't really perceive it, her life and her lifestyle and what's going on as overly stressful, because it's just who she is on a regular basis. But after a period of time of working together, she realized I was probably burning the candle at both ends. And I know for me, that was one of the challenges that I think led to some of my insulin resistance and Hashimoto's was I was burning the candle at both ends. I was eating well, but I was overtraining, under-recovering, work stress, lifestyle stress, business stress. I have all these stressors. It didn't seem abnormal to me. I was keeping up, but I wasn't allowing for enough recovery and decompression. I definitely wasn't working necessarily on trying to calm my sympathetic nervous system at the time. I just felt that that's how I was. It could be respiratory stress, how well you breathe. If you don't breathe well, that can create hypoxia, and that can cause cells to go into excessive stress mode. And sleep deprivation or disruption could be problems. And typically, somebody doesn't have one of these issues. They typically have multiple of these issues. But when you have excessive stress in these situations, that triggers this cell danger response I talked to on the podcast, in the book, the Thyroid Debacle, and I talk about it on all these Thyroid Thursdays and other things. That results in a reduced peripheral conversion of T4 to T3. We call that cellular or tissue hypothyroidism. Now, that cell danger response can alter glucose and insulin regulation, resulting in dysglycemia, glucose resistance, insulin resistance, and high insulin levels to maybe maintain a glucose level within the range. But then that leads to prediabetes and then to diabetes. And it could be type 1, type 2. So when you have excessive stress, it alters glucose and insulin regulation by a number of different ways. It can cause dysregulation of the beta cells of your pancreas, so they stop working appropriately because of this stress response. You can have alteration in lipid metabolism. So now you've got excessive lipid production and generation, and that can alter glucose physiology. It can alter insulin physiology. You can have an upregulation of the immune inflammatory system. And if you have a stress response and you increase inflammatory proteins, we know that that can increase the T4 to T3 conversion in the hypothalamus, but it also decreases the conversion of T4 to T3 in the peripheral metabolism, and that can result in decreased glucose being transported into the cell. So inflammation is going to drive more glucose and insulin resistance. You get activation of the sympathetic nervous system, so more fight or flight type response goes on, so more glucose is being pushed out into the bloodstream, but the cells are not able to utilize it effectively, so that can cause glucose levels to rise and insulin to rise with it. You can have an upregulation of what they call the RAS system, which is then with renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, so that primarily has an influence on your mineral levels, what gets excreted, what doesn't. It can have an impact on sodium potassium balances, and it can have an impact on blood pressure and vasoconstriction, but it also influences blood sugar regulation. And then number 6, it can also enter your endocrine system. So your adrenal gland, everybody talks about adrenal fatigue, but if you've got this excessive stress response going on, the adrenal gland has to make priority. Do I need to make more androgens and estrogens, or do I need to make more cortisol? And if I'm making more cortisol to support this stress response, that's going to upregulate glucose. And the dysregulation of your sex hormones also can have an impact on glucose and blood sugar regulation. Any cell stress response is going to alter thyroid physiology. An acute stress response is not a big deal. Short term, the stress goes away, there's a short term adaptation, and everything can go back to normal. But you're really in a chronic stress state. And many of you are sitting here going, but I don't have a chronic stress state. But you probably do. You're just so used to it that you don't realize these things are going on. That chronic stress state, caused by multiple factors, physical, chemical, microbial, psychological, respiratory, sleep, is what's driving the glucose and insulin resistance. So if you've been on a low carb diet and still have high glucose, if you've tried keto and you still had high glucose and insulin resistance and felt awful, it's not about the glucose and the fats as much as it is, there's something triggering that stress response. And that's what you got to deal with. Because when you have this excessive cell stress response and you get down regulation of the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3, and you'll also have upregulation of the immune inflammatory response, this leads to thyroiditis. This leads to damage and destruction of the gland, and just putting more T4 or T3 into the system isn't going to fix the cell stress, cell danger response. And that's why many of you, it doesn't matter which T4, T3, doesn't still seem to impact your glucose or your insulin resistance. You don't feel well on those medications because it's not a medication. The solution isn't more medication. The solution is what's creating that excessive cell stress. And these are the factors you have to deal with. The physical stressors, the chemicals, the microbes, respiratory, sleep, and the psychological stress. And I think of the psychological stress is one of the biggest things that we just don't pay enough attention to. We call it depression, we call it anxiety, and then we take a medication. But really, we need to spend less time dealing with problems and spend more time in trying to calm down our immune system and our stress response, and that's how we get well. Hopefully this helps.